Time to get started with our class this morning. If you would be opening your Bibles to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24. Last Sunday we began discussing this chapter and we got down to verse 3. Matthew chapter 24, verse 3. Jared, would you lead our prayer for us this morning?
Heavenly Father, we come before this another day, thanking you so much for the opportunity we have to be here for family and friends, to dive into your word, to learn more about you, to learn how we can better ourselves to walk the Christian life. We thank you so much for Josh and his abilities to lead this class this morning. Please be with not only Josh, but all the other teachers across the world, and help them all present the material to us in a way that we can retain it. Please help us to put all the worldly things out of our minds as we go throughout this hour this morning. Please watch over us, protect us, and be with those who are not here. Let us be able to be back as soon as possible. Thank you so much for your Son. It's in his name that we pray.
Amen. Matthew chapter 24 is what we sometimes hear referred to as Jesus' Olivet Discourse. Because if you notice in verse 3, it says that Jesus has gone out and he is seated upon the Mount of Olives. Remember, as we summed up chapter 23, Jesus has essentially told the Jews, I'm not going to waste any more time on you. He says, I've been with you, I've talked to you, you've witnessed my miracles, but yet you continue to reject me. So he says, you're not going to hear from me anymore. I'm not going to waste my breath on you. Well, as he left out of the company of the Jews, many of his disciples were there, and we talked last week about the fact that they wanted to show him around Jerusalem, especially there around the temple complex. Wanted to show him all of the splendor of that area. And Jesus basically tells them, I know, I've been here, I know what this is like. He says, but what you fail to realize is that this place is going to be destroyed. He says, there will not be left one stone upon another. It's all going to be destroyed. He said, no longer is there going to be a central location that's going to be the focus of your worship. Remember, the Jews, they were required at certain times of the year to go up to Jerusalem. They were required to go to the temple to pay taxes as well as to offer sacrifices. But Jesus says that's all coming to an end. This system that was focused upon outward ritual. He said this is all coming to an end. He said nothing is going to remain of this. It's all going to be destroyed. Well, after that, we see that Jesus goes out to the Mount of Olives. And he sits there, and while he's there, some of his disciples come to him and they ask him 3 questions. And what we're going to see in chapters 24 and 25 are his answers to these 3 questions. Notice what he says in verses 3 and 4. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, tell us, here's the first question, tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? So here's the 3 questions. When's the temple going to be destroyed? Jesus, how are we going to know when you're coming again? What's going to be the signs of that? And how are we going to know when the world is coming to an end? So you see, they're slowly starting to open their mind to the reality that this is not going to be an earthly kingdom, that Jesus is not going to establish some type of kingdom on this earth. They're slowly starting to realize that Jesus is going to depart. They're slowly realizing that, yes, the temple is going to be destroyed, but there's still things that they don't understand. Well, they were asking for signs. And I can understand why the Jews would ask for a sign. And certainly these disciples were ones who had been Jews in the past. Well, the Jews would have been looking for signs because what had they been looking for before Jesus came? They had been looking for the signs that had been prophesied concerning the Messiah. So they were used to that. They were used to someone telling them, now here is a checklist of what you need to be looking for. And so they've come to Jesus and they're wanting that kind of information, that kind of detail about these questions. Well, in verse 4, and Jesus answered and said unto them, take heed that no man deceive you. So starting out, he says, you need to be careful. People are going to come along that are going to try to tell you things that are not true. People are going to try to deceive you into believing many things concerning these three areas: the fall of Jerusalem, the second coming of Christ, and the end of the world. Well, how many different ideologies do we see in the world today concerning those three things? Hundreds. But Jesus says, be on guard. Don't let anybody deceive you. Well, this is a lead-in to the fact that he is about to reveal to them the things that they need to know. The things to keep in mind about these three events. Yes, people are going to come along and try to tell you more things. He says, but don't be deceived. They don't know what they're talking about. He says, for many shall come in my name. They will come claiming to be coming from Christ, coming by his authority or receiving revelations from him. Many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. You know, down through history, there have been a number of individuals that have had the audacity to claim that they were Christ come again. There have been others, many others, that have come that have claimed that they were sent by Jesus, or that they received some type of vision or some type of revelation directly from Jesus. Jesus said people are going to come and they're going to be claiming to do all these things in my name, or claiming that they are me. He says, but don't be deceived. He said, many are going to be deceived, but don't let you be one of those. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Every time, and this is something that it's really not funny, but it's something that I almost find myself chuckling at. Because each and every time that we hear of a new war breaking out in this world, you will have someone come out and say, this is a sign of the end times. This is a sign that Jesus is coming again. Jesus says, you're going to hear about wars. You're going to hear about rumors of wars. He says, that's inevitable. It's going to happen. Folks, we know mankind can't get along. Wars have been a part of the nature of man nearly from the beginning. But notice he says these things must come to pass. He says, but no, the end is not yet. Simply put, he said war is not going to be a sign. It's not going to be used as a sign of any of these things. It's not going to be a sign that Jerusalem's going to fall. It's not going to be a sign of the end of time. It's not going to be a sign of Jesus' second coming. War is just war. It's just something that's going to happen.
It's pretty well an everyday thing.
It is. And if you remember a while back, and I can't remember the statistics right off the top of my head, but someone had asked a question on our question and answer night about Christians going to war. And someone had gone back, and I don't know how they did this, but they went back as far as recorded history was possible. And they had discovered that there's only been I want to say it was 240 something years of complete peace on earth from the beginning of recorded history down through today. There's always been some type of war, some type of skirmish, something taking place. Because like Sister Sue said, it's an everyday thing. It's something that we always hear about. But he says, these are not intended to be a sign. This is just a part of earthly life. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Now, once again, folks, he's talking about things that are natural occurrences. He says nations are going to rise up against nations. We've seen that. Kingdoms against kingdoms, yes. But then he also says there's going to be famines. Folks, we still hear, especially in Africa, we still hear of intense famines taking place on earth today. We hear about, as it says here, pestilences. In a way, you could almost describe COVID-19 as a pestilence because it was an illness that came in and affected a large number of the land. And yes, some people looked at that and they said, well, this is God's judgment. Because our world has become so sinful, God has sent this plague, this pestilence upon the earth to wipe out those that are sinful. Well, my argument to that, how many Christian people do we know that have died from COVID-19? A lot.
Do you think that there could be a reason for all that would be to humble us and make us see that we're not in charge of everything?
It should. And certainly we can look at the things that go on around us. And as we see there in verse 8, these are the beginnings of sorrows. We all know that when we face hard times, difficulties, sorrows, it will turn us one of two ways. It'll either turn us closer to God or further away from God. In my line of work, I often say that death brings out either the best or the worst in people. And we see that in so many other areas. You look at those who, you take those in the healthcare setting, especially nursing home setting. You see some individuals, they get into the nursing home and their faith blossoms. They get stronger and stronger. But then you see others that get in that type of situation and they just quit. They lose their faith. And so certainly the things that we face in this life, the Bible talks about that we should count it all joy when we fall into temptation, when we have these trials, and certainly those are things that fit the bill of temptation. Anything that is put before us that has the capability of turning us away from God, folks, that's a temptation. But we should count it all joy when we face those times because that is a trying or a purifying effect upon our faith. We should allow those times to be those that make us stronger. Well, notice what Jesus says. He says, yes, there's going to be these difficult times. There's going to be famines. There's going to be pestilences. There's going to be earthquakes. He said, and these are going to happen in different areas all across this world. He said, and these are the beginning of sorrows. Now, something that I want you to keep in mind as we continue down in this chapter. There are two prevailing views among those in the Lord's church as to what this chapter is referring to. There are some who look at this and they say everything that we see in chapter 24 is alluding to the fall of Jerusalem. There are others who look at this and they say no, about half of the chapter is dealing with the fall of Jerusalem, but then we see about halfway down a shift in thought. And no longer is Jesus talking about the fall of Jerusalem, but he then begins to answer this second question that the Jews asked. What are going to be the signs of your second coming? And we see that this is a logical progression in answering the questions because that is a timeline of what's going to happen. You know, Jerusalem has already fallen, but Jesus has not come again. But Jesus has to come again before this world comes to an end. And so he's going to answer their first question, that which was the most imminent, which was the fall of Jerusalem. Then he's going to answer the question about his second coming. Then he's going to talk about the end of the world. Now, I tend to hold to that second ideology where about half of this chapter is dealing with the fall of Jerusalem and about half of this chapter is dealing with Jesus' second coming. Now, there is a view in the Lord's church today among some, and I'm going to tell you this view is one that is so outlandish, I don't understand a lot of it. But it's what's commonly referred to as the AD 70 doctrine or realized eschatology. And I know you'll remember that about as long as it took me to say it. But basically what they claim is that when Jerusalem fell, Jesus came again. And then from that point forward, there's so many different splintering ideas from that I can't wrap my mind exactly around what they believe. But ultimately they say, well, since Jesus came again at the fall of Jerusalem, he came back, he established his kingdom at that time. The church didn't come into establishment on Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. The church came into establishment in AD 70. And that Jesus is now reigning over the church. But they have so many different ideas, and Carrie or someone else here that may have studied this more deeply might be able to expound on this a little bit more. But basically they say Jesus is not coming again because he's already come back. There's not going to be a resurrection, and that so much of what we read about in the Scripture about Jesus' second coming, it's already happened. And so, as I said, there's so many questions that arise. Well, what happens when we die? How is this world eventually going to come to an end? And there's so many differing opinions and differing ideas on that. But where that comes from is they look at Matthew chapter 24 and they say, well, you look at this and the way that Jesus has this worded, it's like this is all one big event. That there's no break in the thought. But I think we'll see, and I know we won't get that far today. It'll probably be next Sunday. But I think what we will see as we get down to the second part of this chapter is you're going to see a marked difference in the language that he uses. The characteristics and the things that he mentions, they're going to be different than what we see here in the first part. Okay, he says, these are the beginning of sorrows. Now, at this point, we're going to begin to see some of the things that he is going to foretell these disciples about the fall of Jerusalem. He's coming to answer this question. They, or verse 9, then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. So starting out, he says, you're going to face these natural trials of life. He said that's the beginning of the sorrows you're going to face. That's the sorrows that every person is going to face. He said, but for you, now keep in mind, he's talking to those in the first century specifically. There's going to be some general applications that we can make, but specifically, he's speaking to those in the first century at this point. He said, but then they're going to come and they are going to persecute you. They're going to deliver you over to be afflicted. You're going to be hated. Why? Because you're a Christian. We've talked quite a bit in our Wednesday night class. We're studying the book of Revelation about how in that first century time period, the Christians really faced three major periods of persecution. The first happened in quite rapid timeline after the church came into establishment. And that was the persecution that was handed down by the Jews, that was spearheaded ultimately by Saul of Tarsus. I believe that that is what Jesus is referring to in this verse. Remember, we're talking about the fall of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is going to be destroyed because the Jews rebel against Rome. And notice that he says, they shall deliver you up to be afflicted, shall kill you for my name's sake. Well, what was Paul doing, or Saul? He was going out, he was arresting Christians, he was throwing them into prison, he was standing by giving the authority for certain ones to be killed, and he was right at the point of trying to expand that persecution. You know, he had centered his attention around the city of Jerusalem. And that was the logical place, because most of those, as we read in Acts chapter 2, most of those who had come to Jerusalem for Pentecost, those who were baptized into Christ, they didn't want to leave. They didn't want to go back home. They wanted to stay there and learn as much as they could. Well, then Saul rose up and began to persecute the church. And at this point, they began to go back to their home. They began to scatter from the city of Jerusalem. Well, Jesus says this persecution is going to come, and that is going to add to these sorrows. He says you're going to have the natural sorrows that go along with life. He said, but your life is going to get more difficult because this persecution is going to come. He said you're going to be hated because you are Christians. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another, and many false prophets shall rise, and shall deceive many. He said it's going to reach the point where false doctrine is going to come in. You're going to have, and the main group that they faced issues with in the first century were the Judaizing teachers, the ones that came in trying to bring certain tenets of Judaism back into the church. But he said you're going to have those that hate the church, but yet they're going to come in under the guise of being Christians, of being faithful, but ultimately they're false prophets, and their desire is to try to lead people astray. Well, read through the writings of Paul, and then read the letters to the 7 churches. How many of those churches were dealing with this very type of problem? Just about every one. They were dealing with this issue of false teachers coming in. But you notice, as I said, they had developed some tactics about them that made them more persuasive. They looked like Christians. They called themselves Christians. They had a reputation of being Christians. But yet what they were teaching was not that which was becoming the name of Christ. They were teaching false doctrine. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. There are some translations and some commentators that look at this and they say there's going to be some that are going to give up. There's going to be some that are going to lose their faith. They're going to turn away from their first love. He says because of iniquity, because of sin, because of accepting false doctrine. He said there's going to be many that the love that people have, not only for each other, but for God and for the gospel, it's going to grow cold. They're going to fall away. They're going to go back into their old way of life. Once again, that's a reality that we still see today. How many of those through the years have we seen that have been baptized into Christ that ultimately fell away? Sadly, it's a pretty high number. But he's saying these are all things that were going to happen to the church. And he says these are things that are going to happen just in this 40-year span. From the time that the church came into establishment until the time that Jerusalem fell. He said these are all things that's going to begin to happen during that period of time. Within a 40-year period. They faced a lot of problems. A lot of trials. He said, but if you're faithful, but if you endure, he said, then you will be saved. Those who stay strong and devoted, they will be saved. Now keep that statement in mind, because something is going to be revealed as we read further on down in this chapter that I think is going to bring us right back to what we just saw there in verse 13. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. He's talking about the fact that the gospel was going to go out from Jerusalem. That was going to be the hub, so to speak, where the furtherance of the gospel would go out from that point. We read in the book of Acts about those early evangelists that went out, and most of them were going out from Jerusalem. Any time that there were issues that needed to be discussed, where did they go? They came back to Jerusalem and they discussed it. Why? Because that's where the church began. That's where most of the early leaders of the church were. You know, you go back and you study the life of the apostles, at least the ones that we have documented evidence of their life. And most of them, of course, there were a few like Paul and Peter and a few others that eventually they spread from Jerusalem and had their center of influence in other areas. But most of the apostles, they kept their influence around Jerusalem. The gospel was going to go out from Jerusalem. Said it's going to go out unto all the nations that were around. He said, but then the end is going to come. Remember, he's not talking about the end of the world. At this point, he is not talking about his second coming. He's talking about the end of Jerusalem. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation. I've always liked that statement. The abomination of desolation. He said it was spoken of by Daniel the prophet. He says, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Who is the abomination of desolation? Let me just throw that out. Who's the abomination of desolation? Any idea? Some look at this and say it's talking about Satan and his forces. Some look at this and say, oh, that's talking about Antichrist. No. Folks, the abomination of desolation was the Roman army. It's those forces that we've been talking about on Wednesday night that were led by Titus to go and try to quell this revolt that the Jews had brought against Rome. He says, therefore, when you look up and you see them coming, know this is what Daniel was talking about. This is what he prophesied about the destruction of Jerusalem. But when he says there, stand in the holy place. Another translation puts it this way, and I really prefer this. It says, stay faithful. Don't lose faith. When you look up and you see this great army coming your way, don't lose heart. Don't give up. Stay strong. He said, whoso readeth, let him understand. And he's saying, whenever you read these passages from Daniel, know that this is what it's talking about. Now, from what we have studied, those of you that are in our Wednesday night class, why didn't Jesus just come out and say, when you see the Roman army coming? We've talked about this a lot. Why didn't he just say, when you see the Roman army coming? Well, who was in force at the time? Who was in power? What did they not have the right to do? We talked about this Wednesday night. What did they not have the right to do? They didn't have the right to speak ill against Rome. And so if Jesus spoke up and said, when you see Rome coming, they're coming with the belief that they are coming to destroy, but you stay strong. You stay faithful. And understand what Daniel is talking about, that they are coming to destroy Jerusalem. So he uses this term, the abomination of desolation, so that those who read that would understand that this is talking about Rome. That's why in Revelation we see the image of the beast and the scarlet woman and all of these other things in reference to Rome and its emperor. Because her citizens were not allowed to speak any word of disagreement against them. And so Jesus knew that had he told them, Rome's the one that's coming, that word would have got out. His people would have been in much more danger. And so using this same type of tactic that we see him using in revealing these revelations to John, we see him using that in revealing this prophecy to his disciples at this time. This abomination of desolation was going to come. But look at verse 16, and this is a passage that I believe is very telling whenever we read of what the historian Josephus wrote in his book Antiquities. Verse 16 says, "Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains." Yes, ma'am.
For those that are looking at these scriptures and acting like this is talking about the second coming of Christ, it's talking about Judea.
Exactly.
So, I mean, how are they making that into...
Well, if you remember, many of those who hold to these premillennial or postmillennial views, they still believe that Israel or Judea is going to play an important role. They believe that that kingdom is going to be established in Judea, in the city of Jerusalem. And so a lot of their arguments come from the point that, Jesus ascended from that land. He's going to come back in the same way. Therefore, he's going to come back to that literal place. He's going to establish a kingdom in that literal place. As I said, there's so many differing ideas out there, and so many of them are so far-fetched that, as I said, I can't wrap my mind around where they're getting some of these things because it is so contrary to what the Bible teaches. But look at verse 16. Them which are in Judea. Folks, he's talking about the Christians. He says the Christians that are in Judea. He says when you look up and you see the abomination of desolation, when you see the Roman army coming, that is your sign to get out of town. Leave. Flee the city of Jerusalem. Don't stay around. Because if you stay, you're probably going to die. Flee to the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. He says, don't even pack anything up. He says, if you look up and you see him coming, you tuck tail and run. Don't stop. Don't go into the house and try to pack up any kind of belongings. You get yourself and your family, you get out. That's your sign. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. Go. Get away. Now, something that I want you to think about for just a moment. Josephus records that when Titus came to the city of Jerusalem, ultimately to lay siege to the city, he came and he surrounded the city. He did this unannounced. And then for some reason, Titus didn't know why. Josephus didn't know why. But for some reason, he decided that he was going to pull back for 3 days. Something that had never been done in military history before. They were there. They were prepared for battle. They had the city surrounded. And then suddenly their leader says, no, let's pull back. Let's retreat for 3 days. Folks, this is a secular historian recording this. But then that historian goes on to say that in that 3-day period, every single Christian in the city of Jerusalem fled. Not a single Christian died in the siege of the city of Jerusalem. Why? Because they heeded Jesus' warning. Because he told them what to be looking for. When you see them coming, get away. Don't stick around. He said, the one that's on the housetop, the one that's in the field, don't waste your time going back home. Don't pack anything up. Just go. Leave. Rebuild your life. And woe unto them that are with child, verse 19. And to them that give suck in those days, but pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be.
Right there gives a hint that they worship on the Sabbath day. That was under that old law still yet.
That's right. He's talking about the Jews.
Yeah.
He said, and also, something to keep in mind, the gates of the city of Jerusalem were kept closed on the Sabbath day because people were not allowed to come and go. They weren't allowed to leave the city. They weren't allowed to travel. They weren't allowed to work. So if the abomination of desolation came on the Sabbath day, they wouldn't be able to get out. And he also, notice that he says, woe unto them that are with child, those that are pregnant or those that have small infants. He said it's going to be more difficult on you if it comes during that time. He says also, pray that this doesn't happen during the winter. It snows sometimes in Jerusalem. The mountains around Jerusalem, oftentimes in the wintertime, stay covered with snow. It would have been much more difficult. He says, so in your prayers, he said, you need to be praying that when this time does come, that it is a time that is not going to have these external influences that's going to make it more difficult upon you. All right, we're out of time. Brad's not here to ring the bell, so I think we actually should have stopped a couple of minutes ago. But we'll go ahead and we'll stop there for today. Lord willing, next Sunday morning, we'll go ahead and we'll discuss verse 21, starting next Sunday morning.